name is Kiril Karamotchev. I am a 12-year-old from Bulgaria. Currently, I am on a road trip with my father. We are closing in about 40 kilometers from Belgrade, and I'd like to tell you some information that I've researched and looked at myself about the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. So, I'm gonna give you some quick intel. Time of the explosion was on the 26th of April 1986 at about 1:23 a.m. and 45 seconds when it happened. So a quick basic explanation of what happened. It wasn't necessarily a nuclear explosion, it was a steam and hydrogen explosion. But I'll give it I will simplify it and tell you the entire story how it happened. So first of all, they were currently at the process of running a test right before, on the day before. But the team A wasn't able to complete it. They were too tired, they were unfocused, and they weren't allowed to continue, and the team B took over. Team B, as expected, the B team, the second choice team, was less experienced and more of a rookie type. But of course, they still had the supervision from a man named Anatoly Dyatlov. Anatoly Dyatlov was a very difficult person who thought he had the authority to control people, though in most cases he didn't. But here he had it, and he thought he could use it for the most and as much as he could. Anatoly Dyatlov was also, he really wanted to complete this test because he was on the brink of becoming the main engineer in the Chernobyl, in the NPP Institute, and he was about to become main engineer, and he wanted that so badly. He didn't care how it was ran, he just wanted results and wanted to become main engineer. So, the team started the procedure. They read it through a bit, some of them were nervous, and it said 700 megawatts is how much power they should set the reactor to thermal power. But it was set to 700, but they set it a little bit too low after that. They set it lower, and because there's something that builds up in the reactor while it's fissioning, and if you don't have enough power to flush it out, it can affect the reactivity and slow it down. This is called xenon. It is something that's left by uranium, and it technically slows reactivity. And to remove it, typically with heat, you flush it out. But they were at too low thermal power to be able to do this, and more of this started to build up, which continued and lowering the power until we reached 20 MV thermal power, which was way too low. So the supervisor, Anatoly, so let's call him Dyatlov here, became very mad. He asked them how were they able to get this job, and he was annoyed. And the computer said to turn off the reactor and wait 18 hours. But rather than doing that, he thought to himself, the reactor doesn't know that we are having a test right now. Do as I say. And he told them, not remove every single control rod, but remove most of the control rods inside the reactor. And so they did. But because of flaws in the design, there was instability at low power. So after they removed all the control rods, they were at 200 megawatts. So because of the instability, because of something called positive void coefficient, which if you have 2 liter water, most of the steam, which is in an RBMK reactor, is called voids, and because it's getting pumped through slower, affects the reactivity, which makes it unstable. Because water removes heat and is an absorber, which slows reactivity, but steam doesn't do any of that, and it reacts with the reactivity, of course, as I said. And so they're getting more and more of that. Because of the instability, power jump. 200 megawatts thermal power to 400 in a reactor. That's way too much. So they pressed one button, which purpose was to shut it all down, scram. In this reactor, it was called AZ5. In other reactors it has other names, but here it was called AZ5. It was supposed to be a simple button you press, And yeah, he thought there was a backdoor, something that could prevent anything from happening to the supervisor. He thought nothing could happen, but there was a slight issue with the scram button. The scram button, necessarily, it shut down the reactor. Yes, it did. But the people found out a few years back, prior to the incident, I forgot where it was, they had to use a scram button on one of the reactors, still in the USSR, because it was on another RBMK 1000, and the power hiked for a tiny moment before going back down. And they thought of that because control rods is what they're sinking in when you press AZ5, and control rods are, as in the name, meant to control the reactor. They were made of a material named boron, which slows reactivity. What the issue now was with the control rods is tips. The tips were made of graphite, which accelerates reactivity because graphite is a moderator in an RBMK. A moderator moderates the fission. It slows down the neutrons to the exact point, or it doesn't to exact point. It's impossible, but it slows them where the possibility becomes higher that it fissions. And if you add more of the moderator, the probability increases. So that's what happened, because the tips were made of graphite that accelerated reactivity. Now that the power was still hiking from 200 to 400 and it was continuing, they pressed the button. The button, though, accelerated it. It helped it. The power went all the way from 400 megawatts thermal power to 33,000. But no, not thermal power. The output power was 33,000 megawatts, which was insane. The reactor was made for 1,000 megawatts, and it outputted 33,000, which at the time was enough to power the entire Soviet grid. And of course, if you're expecting something is gonna happen when you're going 33x above the output and what this reactor is able to be capable of. So of course, first thing that happens, steam explosion. All the water turns to steam. The steam lines, because in a reactor you use steam to spin a turbine. Turbine spins a generator, and the generator creates power. There's steam lines. The steam lines overpressurized and exploded. And of course, air got in, and that's an issue, because when you're going up in power, you're also going up in heat, and when it becomes too hot, it also reacts with reactivity. For example, the fuel rods where the uranium was in were the fuel rods were made of zirconium, which is a very good and durable material which doesn't corrode, and it's very good with heat. But once you make it so hot, superheated, that it starts reacting too. It took the water molecules from steam, because after all, steam is water vapor. It took the water molecules and made the steam to hydrogen, and when hydrogen gas and an oxygen mix, I forgot why, but it's simplified edition. When hydrogen gas and air mix, it explodes, and so much of this hydrogen was made because there was so much steam and so much air mixed. There was a second explosion. The second explosion, it shot up the 1,000-ton steel cap, like it threw it like a coin. It flipped up, it destroyed the roof, it flew back, and it landed vertically, not horizontally like it's supposed to be, like a lid, vertically, like a coin. And that's also how it sits today. And now another issue, because the Soviets, they didn't want the fourth reactor Chernobyl as a power output. They wanted it as a sign of power, and so they made it as cheaply as possible. They didn't even build a containment building around it, which of course, if something happens, there's no containing it. It's going into the air. And a fissioning reactor, after it exploded, it still is fissioning, because of course the uranium is still there. It didn't explode like a atomic bomb. It's still there. It's still fissioning. It's still creating heat, and it's still burning. And now this fissioning reactor was putting up poisonous gases, also ionizing radiation, gamma rays, into the air. And another issue with that was this gas is very light. It's not like in the HBO Max series where it's dark and you can't see anything. It's very light, it's very see-through, you can't really tell. And that's the issue. This gas, this radioactive stuff turned to clouds and it rained too. But the issue is, the only real way that you could tell for a normal person is either a metallic taste on your tongue, like a bluish look, or a dosimeter. And I come to the next point, dosimeters. To check radiation after if something happens to the reactor, most of the time they check it with dosimeters. They had a dosimeter which maximum range was 3.6. 3.6 Rontgen. Rontgen is a very old style to measure ionizing radiation. 3.6 it was ionizing, but it wasn't great, it wasn't terrible. So the uninformed people thought 3.6 Rontgen was the equivalent of one chest X-ray, but it was about 800 chest X-rays. And that was also, as I said, not great and not terrible. But a name named Legasov, that was his last name, he was called up to the reactor because they of course needed help. You can't just do it with say 3 men. They needed somebody else. And he took a look at it and he was like, no, this is concerning, because he saw graphite. Graphite is only found inside the reactor core building. And in the documents, a firefighter, was burned by a black smooth mineral, graphite, which was also extremely hot because it's jumping out of a reactor that was, let's say, 30,000 Fahrenheit inside. So he also burned his hand. It was also radioactive, of course. And so the people thought he was mistaken. They thought it was concrete. But he was sure, he was concerned that the 3.6 reading was far greater, it was a far bigger number. He was concerned about that. So once he was at the site, they brought a high limit dosimeter with a limit of 15,000 Rontgen. That's a lot. They grabbed a truck, put on lead shielding, put a man in it, and sent him as close as possible to the reactor building. Once he came back, it wasn't 3.6 Rontgen. It maxed out the other dosimeter. 15,000 Rontgen. That's deadly. That's more than just 800 X-rays. Who knows? 10s, 30, 40, 50, I have no idea. And that's an issue because you have a city 20 kilometers from there. It was a city, Pripyat. And there are 50,000 people there which were exposed to radiation for far too long, for about 2 days. Which was too late because they didn't evacuate them immediately because they didn't know the dangers of what was happening. And they evacuated them, and again, the evacuation zone was 20 kilometers. It was supposed to be more than 20. It was supposed to be, let's say, 100 kilometers. Because you're dealing with an exploded reactor. And another issue was, this was the first time this has ever happened in history. Nobody had a solution to how to stop this. So what they did was smother the reactor with sand and with boron, what the control rods are made of to slow the reactivity. But smothering it won't immediately stop everything. You can put it out, so you can stop it from outputting, but it can still start a meltdown, which also could have happened because it could also have melted down. You could stop the gases from coming, but it could also melt down. Simplified, it could also melt down. That was also another fear that was. And because you have a fissioning reactor that's extremely hot, it's gonna burn through everything that's coming. Everything there is. So, the issue now with this is, there were tanks under the reactor core. These were emergency tanks. When the reactor had too little water, these injected it in. And each pipe in the entire reactor building led to these tanks. You could say, oh yeah, but at the time of the explosion, the tanks were nearly empty. There can be no thermal explosion. But if every single pipe in the entire building leads to these tanks, all the excess water was pumped into these tanks. Now I have completely full tanks and a fissioning reactor, which is burning through biological shields and concrete, which was going to, of course, cause an extremely big thermal explosion. It could have destroyed the other 3 operating reactors in Chernobyl, because there were four of them, and this could have caused the killing of millions and millions of people, because 200 kilometers away you have Kiev, and then I think 400 away, and then you have Minsk, and this could have caused the killing of many people. And they had to sacrifice the lives of 3 men. They emptied out the tanks back into the back. Where though? Into the Pripyat river, which was connected to the nuclear power plant, where the nuclear power plant got its water from. But okay, the tanks are empty, they're gonna melt through the tanks. But if they continue melting, they'll get into the water source. And the water source was the Pripyat river, which is also the water source for many millions of people, because it also reached, the water also was for Kiev, it was for Minsk, it was for many other cities, and it could have affected the drinking water of millions. So they also had to stop that. There were many miners who sacrificed their lives to prevent this from happening. And now the consequences after. Nobody was told of this, not the Soviet people, not the people in Pripyat. They were only evacuated. No foreign press knew of this until they found out. This Legasov held a presentation. It wasn't a presentation. It was more like a presentation in Vienna about what happened. And now, because of the Soviet lies and everything, this man, now because he had data of such sensitive stuff, if he released absolutely everything, it would have been very bad for them. So he wasn't free anymore. They gave him an apartment in Moscow, and he wasn't able to talk to anybody. He wasn't going to be killed, but he couldn't talk to any single person on the entire planet. He was isolated, he was alone, and left with a cat. And then in Moscow in the year 1987, he KYS'd himself. And of course that happened. But now to today. They recently, it wasn't that much recently, they started building in 2015. They built a sarcophagus. The first one was meant to last for 30 years, it lasted 40. And they had to build a new one. And they built a new one, which now is new encaging of the reactor. So of course there's still radioactive dust in there. The uranium doesn't just disappear, it's still there, it's still existing. But it isn't, of course it isn't as bad as it was there, but some parts where the rays were, some parts where there was radiation are uninhabitable for millions of years. Millions. Now many have heard of the Russians. They attacked this entombing, the new sarcophagus. But the good thing about the sarcophagus, the engineers were so smart, they built negative pressure when you're entering it. So air comes in, but it doesn't come out. So the radioactive dust stays in the entombing and in the reactor, but it doesn't come back out. And another thing they're doing, with American-bought cranes, they are slowly attempting to remove the uranium and remove everything. Now also, the last part I want to say, now after all the 50,000 people left Pripyat. It's a complete ghost town, but not for wildlife. A lot of wildlife found their homes in the forgotten city, and now they live there. The wildlife is thriving. They tested the wildlife there. Of course, some of it was radiated, but it wasn't to a deadly rate, or else they wouldn't have been able to multiply and reproduce. Goodbye.